January 17, 1946. The frozen air of occupied Germany cut through the wool coats of 37 men and women as they stepped off a military transport plane at Tempelhof Airfield in Berlin. Their breath hung in clouds before them. They were not prisoners returning home. They were not soldiers. They were factory foremen, engineers, union representatives, and municipal officials, German civilians selected by the Allied Control Council for a journey that would crack open the certainty they had carried through 12 years of National Socialist rule. They had been told they would travel to America. They had been told they would see factories. What they had not been told, what they could not have imagined, was that everything they believed about industrial capacity, about national strength, about the very architecture of production, was about to be dismantled before their eyes. The program was called the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee Tour, but its purpose was not technical. It was psychological. It was designed to shatter a myth. For over a decade, the German people had been told they were building the greatest industrial machine in history. The Ruhr Valley thundered with blast furnaces. Krupp forged steel for warships and tanks. IG Farben synthesized fuel from coal. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf stamped out fighter planes in underground factories carved from mountain stone. Goebbels had proclaimed it. German engineering was supreme. German labor was disciplined. German production was unstoppable. And when the war came, that narrative held. Even as the bombs fell, even as the Reich contracted, the belief persisted. If only the factories had held, if only the raw materials had flowed, Germany would have won. The Americans, they were told, were soft, materialistic, chaotic. Their wealth was a mirage. Their production, exaggerated propaganda. Now, these 37 Germans would see the truth. They had walked through the ruins of their own cities. They had seen the twisted girders of the Krupp works in Essen, the shattered hangars of the Messerschmitt plants in Augsburg, the skeletal remains of the Volkswagen factory in Fallersleben. They had lived through the collapse. But what they had not seen, what no German citizen had been allowed to see, was what had been rising on the other side of the Atlantic while their factories burned. The flight to New York took 19 hours, with refueling stops in Shannon and Gander. Most of the passengers did not sleep. They sat rigid in their seats, staring out at the black ocean below, wrapped in U.S. Army blankets, drinking coffee from tin cups. Some had fought in the war. Others had merely survived it. One man, a tool and die maker from Stuttgart named Klaus Reimer, kept a journal. On the flight, he wrote, "We are told we will see Ford. We are told we will see steel mills. I do not know what to expect. I expect nothing can surprise me any more." He was wrong. They landed at LaGuardia on a gray morning in late January. The cold in New York was different from the cold in Berlin. Wetter, heavier, but without the smell of ash. The city rose around them like a vision from a film reel, except it was real, and it was whole. No craters. No burned-out windows. The bridges stood. The lights worked. Traffic moved in rivers of yellow cabs and delivery trucks. Steam poured from manholes. Neon signs blinked above storefronts crammed with goods, canned food, clothing, radios, tools, things stacked in windows as if there were no ration cards, no shortages, no war. Klaus Reimer wrote that night, "I have never seen so much food in one place. Not even before the war." But the food was not the point. Not yet. The next morning, they boarded a train for Detroit. The Rouge River plant of the Ford Motor Company sprawled across 2 square miles of Michigan soil. It was not a factory. It was a continent of industry. Raw iron ore arrived by barge from Minnesota. Coal came by rail from Pennsylvania. Limestone was crushed on site. The blast furnaces ran 24 hours a day, fed by conveyors that never stopped. Molten steel flowed into molds. The molds cooled and moved. Presses the size of buildings stamped fenders, hoods, chassis frames. Engines were assembled on lines that stretched for half a mile. Glass was blown. Tires were molded. Paint was sprayed in chambers filled with mist and color. And at the end, every 98 seconds, a completed automobile rolled off the line, engine running, ready to drive. The Germans stood on an observation platform above the assembly line. For 10 minutes, no one spoke. Klaus Reimer wrote, "I counted 14 cars in 15 minutes. I thought I had miscounted. I counted again. 15 cars in 16 minutes. I do not understand how this is possible." An American guide, a Ford engineer in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a Michigan accent, explained the process. He spoke slowly, through a translator, pointing to each stage. The steel arrived here. It was pressed there. The engine dropped in at that station. Wheels attached at the next. 14,000 workers on the day shift. 14,000 on the night shift. 3 shifts if demand required it. Production capacity: 1 car every 98 seconds. Annual output: over 2 million vehicles. One of the Germans, a foreman from the Opel plant in Russelsheim, asked a question in halting English. How many of these factories does America have? The Ford engineer smiled. Ford has 18 plants across the United States. General Motors has more. Chrysler, about a dozen. Then there's Packard, Studebaker, Nash, Hudson, maybe 50 major automotive plants total, give or take. The translator hesitated before relaying the answer in German. When he did, the foreman's face went pale. Another German, a municipal official from Hamburg named Ernst Vogel, asked a different question. During the war, how much of this was converted to military production? The engineer nodded. All of it. We built bombers here. B-24 Liberators. 1 every 63 minutes at peak production. Tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines. This plant alone produced over 8,000 engines a month for the Air Corps. But we kept civilian production going at other plants. Rationed, sure, but we never stopped making cars. Ernst Vogel wrote in his diary that night, "They built bombers in car factories and cars in bomber factories. We built everything in one place and called it a miracle. We were children." But the Rouge was only the beginning. They traveled to Pittsburgh, to the steel mills that lined the Monongahela River, where open hearth furnaces the size of cathedrals glowed red through the night. To the rolling mills where ingots of white-hot steel were pressed thinner and thinner until they emerged as sheets, as rails, as beams. The noise was apocalyptic. The heat was visible, a shimmer in the air that blurred the shapes of men working in leather aprons and dark goggles. A German steelworker from Essen, a man named Otto Lang who had spent 20 years at Krupp, stood at the edge of a rolling mill and watched a single ingot transform into a 100-foot rail in less than 3 minutes. He asked the shift supervisor how many tons the mill produced per day. "This mill? About 1,200 tons. But we've got 6 mills on this site alone. U.S. Steel runs about 150 mills across the country. We produced over 80 million tons of steel in 1944. In 1 year." Otto Lang's hands began to shake. He turned to Klaus Reimer and said in German, "We were told we made 30 million tons. We were told that was enough. We were told the Americans could not match us." Klaus wrote. He did not speak again for the rest of the day. They saw the shipyards of Newport News, where Liberty ships had been welded together in 4 days, launched, loaded with tanks and grain and ammunition, and sent across the Atlantic in convoys so vast they stretched beyond the horizon. They saw Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, where B-17 flying fortresses had been assembled on lines that mirrored Ford's methods. Fuselage here, wings there, engines mounted, guns installed, flight tested, and delivered to airfields in England within weeks. They saw the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, where women in coveralls wielded torches and cranes lifted hull sections into place like puzzle pieces, and where the phrase "Rosie the Riveter" had been born not as propaganda but as documentary fact. Everywhere they went, the pattern was the same. Scale beyond comprehension, speed beyond belief, and workers who were not soldiers, not slaves, not prisoners, but citizens. Paid citizens. Union members. Men and women who went home at the end of a shift to houses with electricity, with refrigerators, with radios that played music and news and baseball games. One afternoon in Richmond, a German engineer named Friedrich Baumann approached a woman working on a ship's hull. She was welding a seam, sparks showering around her like fireworks. He waited until she finished, then asked through the translator if he could speak with her. She lifted her mask, wiped sweat from her forehead, and nodded. He asked how long she had been working there. "Since 42, she said. "My husband's in the Pacific Navy, so I figured I'd do my part." He asked if she had been trained as a welder before the war. She laughed. "I was a schoolteacher. They trained me in 6 weeks." He asked how much she earned. She told him. He did the math in his head, converting dollars to Reichsmarks, adjusting for purchasing power. She made more in a month than a skilled machinist in Stuttgart made in 3. That night, Friedrich Baumann wrote a letter to his wife that would never be sent, because he did not yet have permission to correspond freely. In it, he wrote, "I do not know what we were fighting for. I thought we were fighting for Germany. Now I think we were fighting against the future." But it was not only the scale of production that shattered them. It was the waste. In a cafeteria at the Ford plant, the Germans were served lunch. Roast beef sandwiches on white bread, potato chips, apples, coffee with cream and sugar, chocolate cake for dessert. They ate in silence, slowly, as if the food might vanish. When they finished, they watched American workers scrape half-eaten sandwiches into trash bins. They watched apples with a single bite tossed away. They watched coffee poured down drains. Klaus Reimer wrote, "They throw away more food in one day than we saw in a month. I do not know if I am angry or ashamed." Another man, a union representative from Leipzig named Hermann Graf, confronted the American guide. "Why do they waste so much? Do they not know there are people starving?" The guide looked confused. "Waste? They paid for it. They can do what they want with it." Hermann tried to explain. "But it is food. Food is precious. You do not throw it away." The guide shrugged. "There's always more. That's the point." Hermann Graf stopped eating meat for the rest of the tour. Not because he was not hungry, but because he could not reconcile the abundance with the memory of his daughter picking through garbage bins in Leipzig in the winter of 1945. The symbolic object, the thing that appeared again and again, was not a weapon. It was not a flag. It was a can opener. In every factory cafeteria, in every mess hall, in every kitchen they visited, there were pyramids of canned food. Canned beef, canned vegetables, canned fruit, canned soup, canned milk, canned everything. And beside each pyramid, a simple mechanical can opener bolted to the counter, worn smooth by 1,000 hands. The Germans marveled at it. Not because it was advanced technology, it was not, but because it represented a system so efficient, so abundant, that food could be sealed in metal, stacked in warehouses, shipped across continents, and opened with a tool so cheap it was left out for anyone to use. One evening, Klaus Reimer pocketed a can opener from a factory cafeteria. Not to steal it, there were dozens. But to keep it. To remember. Years later, he would tell his grandson that the can opener was the most important artifact of the war. Not a medal. Not a weapon. A tool for opening abundance. They had expected to see factories. They had expected to see machines. What they had not expected was to see the workers' homes. In Dearborn, the Ford guide arranged a visit to a neighborhood where plant workers lived. Modest houses, yes. Small yards. But each house had glass windows, intact. Each house had a porch. Many had cars in the driveway, older models, but functional. Inside, the homes had electric stoves, refrigerators, radios, sofas, beds with thick mattresses. The workers were not wealthy, but they were not starving. They were not cold. They were not afraid. Ernst Vogel, the municipal official from Hamburg, asked one worker, a line supervisor, how much of his income went to rent. About a quarter, the man said. Maybe 30% if you count utilities. Ernst did the calculation. In Hamburg, before the war, rent consumed half a worker's income. After the war, there was no rent because there were no homes. Just rubble. That night, Ernst wrote, we were told democracy made people weak. We were told capitalism created poverty. I have seen poverty. This is not it. But the transformation was not immediate. It was not a single moment of revelation. It was cumulative, a weight that grew heavier with each factory, each meal, each conversation. Some of the Germans resisted. They argued that American wealth was an accident of geography, that the United States had not been bombed, that its cities had not burned. They argued that Germany would recover, that German engineering was still superior, that the war had been lost by betrayal, not by production. But the arguments grew quieter, because the evidence was not abstract. It was not a photograph or a propaganda film. It was real. They stood inside it. They touched the machines. They ate the food. They spoke to the workers. And slowly, the myth dissolved. Otto Lang, the steelworker from Krupp, wrote to a friend, we were told we were the greatest industrial power on earth. We believed it because we had nothing to compare it to. Now I have seen what great means. We were not even close. Friedrich Baumann, the engineer, wrote, I thought American democracy was chaos. I thought discipline and order produced strength. But I have seen assembly lines run by free men, and they are faster, more efficient, more powerful than anything we built with slaves. I do not understand how, but it is true. Hermann Graf, the union man from Leipzig, wrote, I was taught that workers in America were oppressed, that they lived in slums, that they had no rights. I have met them. They have cars. They have unions. They vote. I do not know what I was taught anymore. Klaus Reimer wrote simply, this is impossible. And yet it is. The tour lasted 6 weeks. They visited 23 factories, 8 shipyards, 4 steel mills, 2 aircraft plants, and 1 farm in Iowa where a family of 4 grew enough corn to feed 100 families, using machines that could plow 50 acres in a day. When they returned to Germany in March of 1946, they were different men. Some wrote reports for the Allied Control Council, documenting what they had seen, offering recommendations for German reconstruction. Others returned to their towns and said nothing, because what they had seen was too large to explain. A few became communists, convinced that only collective planning could replicate American scale. Most became something else, skeptics of ideology, believers in evidence, men who had seen the future and knew it did not look like the past. Klaus Reimer returned to Stuttgart and reopened his tool and die shop. He never joined a political party again. When his son asked him, years later, why Germany had lost the war, he took out the can opener and set it on the table. "Because they could open 1,000,000 cans a day," he said, "and we were still rationing bread." But the story does not end with the Germans. It ends with the factories themselves. Because the Rouge River plant still stands. Boeing still builds planes. U.S. Steel still pours metal, though the names have changed, though the methods have evolved. The assembly line, the conveyor belt, the systematic integration of raw material to finished product, these were not accidents. They were not gifts of geography. They were the result of a system that allowed invention, that rewarded efficiency, that permitted failure and iteration and competition. They were the product of a society that trusted its workers to think, to innovate, to improve. The Germans had built great machines. But they had built them with obedience, with hierarchy, with the assumption that genius flowed from the top and muscle from the bottom. The Americans had built something different, a system where the man on the assembly line could stop the line if something was wrong, could suggest a change, could make the process faster. Where engineers and workers ate in the same cafeteria. Where profit was shared, however imperfectly, between capital and labor. This was not propaganda. This was structure. And the can opener, the cheap, mass-produced, perfectly functional can opener, was the symbol of that structure. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it was abundant. Because there was always another can. Always another meal. Always another shift. Always more. January 17, 1946. 37 Germans stepped off a plane in New York and entered a world they did not believe existed. They had been told America was weak, chaotic, decadent. They had been told German discipline and order would prevail. They had been told the factories of the Ruhr were unmatched. They were told lies. Not because the Ruhr was not strong. It was. Not because German engineering was not advanced. It was. But because strength is not only discipline. Engineering is not only precision. Victory is not only will. Victory is also abundance. Victory is also freedom. Victory is the ability to throw away half a sandwich because there will be another one tomorrow. The Germans learned this not from speeches, not from films, not from books. They learned it from standing on a factory floor in Detroit and watching a car roll off the line every 98 seconds. They learned it from eating roast beef in a cafeteria where workers laughed and argued and went home to houses with electricity. They learned it from seeing a woman who had been a schoolteacher weld a seam on a warship and earn more than a German machinist with 20 years' experience. They learned that ideology, no matter how fiercely held, cannot survive contact with reality. And the reality was this: America had not merely outproduced Germany. It had outproduced the very concept of production that Germany understood. It had built a system so vast, so efficient, so resilient that it could fight a two-front war, supply its allies, feed its people, and still produce cars for civilian use. It had done what the Reich said was impossible. It had made abundance ordinary. There is a photograph from the tour, taken at the Ford plant in February 1946. 37 Germans stand in a line in front of an assembly line. Their faces are gaunt. Their coats are worn. Behind them, a river of steel and glass moves without pause. The photo is black and white, but even in monochrome, you can see the expression. It is not anger. It is not envy. It is something closer to grief. Grief for a myth that died. Grief for certainty lost. Grief for the realization that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had been told, was not enough, was never going to be enough. Because across the ocean, a different system, a louder, messier, freer system, had built something greater. Klaus Reimer kept that photograph in his wallet for 30 years. When he died in 1976, his grandson found it, along with the can opener, along with the journal. The last entry, written the night before they returned to Germany, read, "I thought I would see factories. I saw the future. I do not know if Germany can become this. But I know we must try. Because the alternative is to remain in the past, telling ourselves we were strong, when we were only loud." This is the story of 37 men who believed a lie and learned the truth. Not because they were told, but because they saw. And seeing, they could not unknow. The factories are still there. The assembly lines still run. The can openers still open cans. And somewhere in Stuttgart, in a drawer in a house rebuilt after the war, there is a simple mechanical tool, worn smooth by one man's hands, kept as a reminder, not of defeat, but of the day impossible became possible, and the world changed.